Okay, so we're in a series, and it's called Words, Life or Death, and this is the fourth message in this series. And today, the title I have for you today, for this particular message, is called Amazing Facts About Words and the Tongue. So that's the title, Amazing Facts About Words and the Tongue. So we're using Proverbs 18:21. You don't need to turn there. You can actually begin to start to turn to James chapter 3 if you like. But I want to read Proverbs 18:21 because it's the basis for all of these messages here. We'll read 20 and 21. From the fruit of a man's mouth his stomach is satisfied. He is satisfied by the yield of his lips. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. So that's the basis, that's the springboard for this series. So the words that we speak are either releasing life or they're releasing death. Now in James chapter 3, we're going to spend some time in the book here of James because it's the longest discussion about the tongue in the entire Bible. The longest one. And since James spends so much time going over this, I'm going to assume it must be very important. And I think you would too. So it's important for us to take heed what he has to say about the tongue and about words. So notice in James chapter 3, and I want you to look at verse 1. I'm going to read from the NIV. It says, "Not many of you should be teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." Now I think partly that's because, you use your mouth, and it's a matter of authority when you teach. And then in verse 2, we all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. Now the King James Version in verse 2 says, "If any man offends not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able to bridle the whole body." Now that's amazing. I think that's simply amazing. If any person doesn't stumble in words, he's perfect. And he's able to bridle or control or direct his entire body. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of lust of the flesh. See, that's not just about sexual lust. It's all sorts of things that we deal with in the flesh or about the flesh. It might be food. It might be improper sleeping habits or exercise. These are areas that we can get out of control in our body, and we are not conforming to the plan that God has for us. Well, we think, what does that have to do with words? How does that pertain to words? Well, James says this amazing thing. He's saying that if you could get your tongue fixed, you can get your body fixed. Now, I'm not the one saying that, okay? I didn't say that. That's what the apostle is saying. That's what he's saying. That's what the Bible reads. So I'm going to give you 4 amazing facts about the tongue from James chapter 3, and then we're going to bring in some more verses as we continue to go through these points. So 4 amazing facts. Here's number 1. Number 1 is the tongue is disproportionately powerful. So if you're taking notes, I'll give you a minute because that's a really big word to write down. But it's the most important word in the sentence. The tongue is disproportionately powerful. It's the most important word there. So it's disproportionately. Let me read over to James chapter 3. Go ahead and take a look here in verse 3. Actually, we'll keep on going. Again, I'm going to read from the NIV. So it says, "When we put bits in the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they're so large and are driven by strong winds, they're steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark." Now notice that James gives 3 witnesses here. And that's what it says. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a thing is established. And that's what you see here. He is going to give 3 witnesses. And in all of these points that I'm going to give you today, by the way, the adverb is the most important word. In other words, the adverb here is disproportionately. The tongue is disproportionately powerful. Now, powerful is an adjective. That's what it is, right? And an adverb modifies, most times, a verb. That's what it does. But it can modify an adjective as well. And so that's what it's doing here. Disproportionately is modifying powerful. That's what's happening. So how powerful? Disproportionately powerful. That's how powerful the tongue is. Here's the point. I could just say that the tongue is powerful. I could say that. But that's not the amazing thing about it. That's not the amazing fact here. I suppose I could say it's insanely powerful, so you get the point. But the amazing fact isn't that the tongue is powerful. It's that it's disproportionately powerful. The tongue is very small. It's a very small part of the body, but its effect is very large. And that's what James is trying to tell us here. And so he uses these three examples in nature that are witnesses to that fact. So the first example that he gives here is a bit in a horse's mouth. And I think you all are familiar, at least you know what a bit in a horse's mouth is. Maybe I could have brought one. I don't have one. Maybe I could have bought one. I don't know. But it's, there's different types of bits, by the way, but usually a metal bit that has some sort of a loop to it that you stick in the mouth and that it controls the way that the horse moves. Now, I grew up as a young child, well, not really young, but I guess even when I was really little, we had horses. My whole childhood, I was around horses. Not constantly, but a very good chunk of my childhood was spent around horses. I rode horses a great deal. And so I think I understand them somewhat well. I'm not an expert, but I understand them fairly well. I do remember trying to break a horse once. That didn't go well. I think it broke me. Got bucked off a couple times before I finally said, forget it, I'm not doing this anymore. But this small piece of metal in a horse's mouth, it weighs about 1 pound or less. So that's about all it weighs, is 1 pound. But it can control the strength and the direction of a 1,200-pound horse on average. Now, I understand some horses are bigger, some will weigh, 2,500 pounds, but I think the average thoroughbred is about 1,200 pounds. So we have a very strong animal that everybody agrees is strong because we measure cars in horsepower. That's what we do. And we can now control that horse with the reins that are connected to the bit or in the mouth of the horse. And you can sit on the saddle of the horse and you can just pull that rein a little bit this way, or you can pull that rein a little bit this way, and the horse will move this direction, and the horse will move this direction, and sometimes you just get a little kick with the spur on the side or a little pressure, and they learn this. This is how they're taught. And you can make the horse go almost any direction you want it. You can make it back up. You can make it spin in a circle, go forward, sideways. I mean, you can make it do a lot of things. It's actually pretty easy when you've got a bit in a horse's mouth. Now, I want you to think about your tongue in regard to that example that James is giving. He's saying that you can control your strength and your direction by your tongue. Now, there are many people who will take these strength tests, and I've done these things, and you probably have done them as well. These tests to find out where your strengths and your weaknesses lie. And I think that's a good idea for everyone to do, especially young people, to understand themselves a little bit better. But let me say something very strongly. If you can't control your tongue, you can't control your strengths. Your strengths are worthless. You can't utilize them correctly. You won't be able to direct them in the right direction. See, a horse without a bit runs wild. It runs completely. I've ridden horses with just halters on before. Like, you don't put a bit in, you just slide the halter on and you hook it up and you jump on the back of the horse. And I've had some success with horses in doing that, but they've all been older. They've all been broken in very well. They all know what they need to do just by some other signals. Now, you had to pull a little bit harder, to try and get them to move the direction that you wanted them to go. But they've all accustomed to the cues of that, so they can be ridden somewhat without a bit. But when I tried that with a younger horse, forget about it. It ain't going to happen. It won't happen. And now I should say that with the older horses, riding them with just a halter, they're just being nice. Really, they're just being nice. They could take off at any second. And I've had some of them do that. They just take off for whatever reason. Something scares them, or they have a hankering to go this direction. And, I just jump off. I'm not going to deal with trying to hang on with them, because you can't stop them if they're going to run without a bit. But a horse without a bit runs wherever it wants to run. And it is next to impossible to control a horse without a bit. In fact, it's downright dangerous. It's dangerous for your life to control a horse without a bit. But a bit utilizes all that strength and its power, and it directs it for a purpose and for a goal. Now, what about you? How about you? You may have a lot of strength and you may have a lot of talent, but you can't control it and direct it because you can't control your tongue. It's that important. I often think about football players when I think about this, and usually it's young football players, or you can even pick young basketball players. Players who come into the league with a tremendous amount of talent, just natural God-given talent. Amazing players, raw talent, amazing gifts of athleticism. But they also need someone to coach them up. They need someone to coach them up to understand how the game is played a little bit better than it was at the lower level. But the difference between the ones who succeed and the ones who fail often come down to the ones who will listen. The ones who will shut their yapper, right, and listen to what the coach is trying to teach them. Those are the ones that succeed versus the ones that fail. They need someone to help them to reach and develop to the potential that they have, to their peak. And the ones that can't control their tongue are the ones that the coaches will finally say, forget it. And they ship them off to another team. And they can't control them, and they ship them off, and finally they're just out of the league. And then they sit back and they wonder what happened to their career. And all those high earning years are gone because they couldn't be quiet, because they wouldn't listen, because they just wanted to yap at the mouth, because they were the best. They were the best coming out of college, and no one's better than them. This is what it often makes me think of, the wasted years. Look back at James chapter 1. Look at James chapter 1. Now, watch carefully, because there are these amazing and surprising verses. James chapter 1 and verse 26 says, if anyone considers himself to be religious. Now, the Greek word here for religious doesn't mean some outward ritual practice or tradition. It means serving God. If anyone considers himself serving God or a servant of God, and yet does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart and his religion or his service to God, and it's worthless. It says it's worthless. Now, I have to just say that again, because somehow I don't think that often hits us as strongly as it should. He's saying, if any of you are serving God, but you don't bridle your tongue, your service to God is worthless. That's what he's saying. It's not worth anything. You ever done something that when you got through and you got done with it and you look back at it, at some point you realize, man, that was all for nothing. That was just completely worthless. I could probably come up with 100 examples. Maybe you could as well. I just came up of one when I was thinking about an example. And I recall, let me go back to my office for a second. I recall climbing through the rafters all the way at the very top, and it's almost 3 stories up. I had to create catwalks to be able to get to the top, to put this foil-backed insulation in, right next to the rafters up top so that the heat would radiate back to try and keep the place cooler. I spent, and somebody I hired spent probably a couple weeks or more doing all of this stuff, laying it all, because that's a massive roof if you remember, and stapling it up there. I remember getting back up in there maybe a month later, and half of them had fallen down. I don't think I had used staples long enough. They were long enough, short staples. And it was like, I looked at this and I thought, man, I did all this for nothing. It was just worthless. It was pointless. And that's what it's like. That's kind of what it's like. We just read that in the Bible. And so James talks about a bit in a horse's mouth. And then he goes on to another analogy. He talks about the rudder of a ship. You know, when we think about large ships, and if I asked you to put down a large ship that you're thinking of, I would suspect that most of you would put down the Titanic. That's what most people think when they think of a large ship. It's what I think of. Maybe you're thinking of a Carnival cruise ship. I don't know. But it was the largest ship at the time, and the rudder of the ship, of the Titanic, weighed an astonishing 100 tons. 100 tons just for the rudder. That's a lot of weight, 100 tons. But do you know how much the ship weighed? 52,000 tons. 52,000 tons. The rudder weight was not even 0.2%. Now, there are standards by which rudders are built. You can go online, you can look at the standards. And depending on the purpose of the boat, some are a bit larger, not by much, and some may be a little bit smaller. It depends on what the boat is. But that little rudder turns that whole ship. 100 tons, and the size of that thing turns 52,000 tons. Now, I'm sure that you could talk to any captain of a ship and ask them, if you ask them, would you ever step foot on a boat without a rudder? And they would look at you, and out of all, if you asked 100 captains, I suspect you would get the same response out of every 100 captains. There is no way that they would do that. They would either laugh at you in your face or they would slap you. It's one or the other. There's no way they're getting on a boat without a rudder or a ship. They absolutely have no control over that gigantic vessel. A rudder, however, can move the ship in a way that can withstand the storms that come against it. And if you know anything about ships and storms, you want to face into it. You don't want to turn sideways. That's deadly. But with the rudder, you can control it, and you go into the storm. You can save the ship and all the people on it. And the winds of a storm or the winds of the circuit could cause that ship to capsize or to run aground or to hit a reef or to hit another ship or smash to pieces against the rock, whatever it may be. So, it's dangerous to be on a horse without a bit, and it's dangerous to be on a ship without a rudder. Brethren, do you realize that many people's lives capsize because their tongues do not face them in the right direction during storms in life, or for that matter, in the calm of life? This is how important the tongue is. And it's not only important when you have a storm, but even when you have good weather and when everything seems to be going great in your life. Even in good weather, if your tongue's not working, even in good times, you can still end up on the rocks. If you've ever been in a boat, you've taken out just a small boat, and you have no rudder, you are at the mercy of whatever little wind or little ripple there is. You can't control anything, even in a little tiny boat. So James uses the analogy of a ship, and then he uses the analogy next of a spark. A little spark and a huge forest fire. And we can all imagine what that's like. In 2018, a man was outside of his California property, and he was putting up a shade cloth that had blown down. The temperature was about 100 degrees outside at the time, but as he was doing that, he disturbed a nest of ground yellow jackets as he was trying to put this cloth back up because it was protecting from the sun. Well, he was allergic to bee stings, so after they stopped swarming, he took a metal post and he hammered it into the hole of the yellow jackets to try and stop it up. Well, a little bit later, he smelled smoke, and a fire broke out that he couldn't put out. And eventually it grew, and it ended up becoming the largest forest fire in California at the time, in 2018. It burned 400,000 acres. Apparently, a small spark from the hammering of the metal jumped off and it lit a bed of tinder that grew to this mammoth proportion, this massive wildfire. And that's what James says happens with tongues. That is how powerful the tongue is. That's what James is saying. He's saying you don't understand that even though that tongue is just a little member of the body, it actually controls the whole body. So number one, it's disproportionately powerful. Okay, number two. Number two is the tongue is inherently evil. The tongue is inherently evil. I'd like you to look at James chapter 3 again. James chapter 3, and I want to drop down to verse 6. James chapter 3 and verse 6. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Verse 8, it is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Now again, the adverb is what's important, because we could just say that the tongue is evil. But that's not really the amazing fact here. He's saying that it's inherently evil. In other words, our evil tongue comes to us naturally. We don't have to teach our children to be rude or to say mean things. That's not something that really needs to be taught. Now, I definitely think that they learn some of these things by watching us, by watching others, but you really don't have to teach them to be mean or to be rude. I remember, I wasn't there, but my wife had told me, of course, the story many years ago, how about when they were at some sort of a get-together for the kids, and they were really little. And Max was over there with some people, and this girl comes along, and she says, "Hey, kid, get out of here." Was that you? Oh, you said that. No. You did? I'm sorry. Max said that. "Hey, kid, get out of here." I thought they said it to you. But that's just the way kids are. Just, said many things myself. I remember being very protective of kids that I played with baseball. And this kid came over, and he was new to the neighborhood, and I didn't like him. And I was just mean to him. And I wanted him out of there. And so I was mean enough that he left. And that's the way kids are. That's the way I was. So we've got that part down pretty easy. But we do have to teach them to say nice things because we have an inherently evil tongue. Let me say it another way. The default setting on the tongue is to destroy. That's the default setting. And unless we change the default setting, we're going to do more damage with our tongue than we are going to do good. So that's what he's telling us here. It's inherently evil. Now, if you think, the tongue is just not really that evil, let me take you back for a minute to prove that to you. Can I take you back to junior high school? You remember being in junior high school? I can see some of you already starting to cry. Reaching for the tissues. That was a tough time. If you were in junior high school in a public school, just mentioning the word, it's a tough thing for some people. It's a time in your life when any physical difference from the norm was an opportunity for anybody in school to pick on you about that particular physical difference. Your body's changing, hormones are emerging, your brain isn't prepared for all that's coming in store. You might have been a little overweight, maybe you're a little underweight. Some people were really skinny and they got made fun of. Maybe you were gangly or you had glasses and they called you Four Eyes. That was a very common thing when I was in school. Or you had braces. Now it's very fashionable to have braces, but it wasn't back then in junior high. Or you may have been taller than everybody. Or you may have been shorter. It doesn't really matter what it is. They're going to find that physical flaw and they're going to pick on you for it. Whatever it was, they're going to comment on. Does anybody remember that, or am I the only one? Everybody remembers some of that, yeah. So, successfully you have repressed those feelings of angst. But now you're all going to call your psychiatrist afterwards. All right, you'll be on the phone to make an appointment with your therapist. Early in junior high, I had a problem with bathing. And my problem was, I didn't bathe. Well, I did when my mother told me, but that was after much complaining. I used to visit my grandmother's house on my dad's side, Grandma Hazelton, Grandpa Hazelton, and I didn't like bathing so much that she would come into the bathroom when I was in the bathtub, and she would scrub my face down with a washcloth, and she would pull my ears back, and she'd scrub behind my ears, and that was just that was hurtful. Not just emotionally, but it hurt when she scrubbed behind the ears. And I didn't realize at the time that you can get this sort of crud behind your ears when you didn't clean behind it. And I had a lot of it. And she would make sure that, you growing up, you'd say, make sure you scrub behind your ears. That was a common thing for kids. You'd tell your kids, make sure you do that because it's an unthought of spot on the body to clean. So anyway, I'd come to school in my unbathed condition, and oftentimes I'd sleep in the same clothes, right? And I would wear those clothes to school. And I remember sitting in science class towards the back there, and along comes April Daly, and she's like one of the most popular girls in school. And she kind of runs her hand across my hair, and she says something to the effect of, time to change the oil, And it's quite embarrassing at the time, actually is now, but of course there were lots of giggles and laughs at my expense. That was quite the thing to do. But I was apparently known as the kid that didn't bathe or didn't wash his hair, at least, I don't know. But of course times changed, and as I grew up a little bit more, I became more concerned about my body odors and began taking care of those issues to the point that I remember coming back the next year, and then girls were whistling at me in the hallway, and that was really odd. So things change, and they can change very quickly. But my point here is, do I have a point here? My point is the tongue is evil, all right? My point is the tongue is evil, and you need to change the default setting on the tongue. Okay, that's point number 2. That's a short point. All right, point number 3. 3 is the tongue is humanly untamable. The tongue is humanly untamable. Now again, think about the adverb here. What's the adverb? The adverb is humanly. It's not just untamable, it's humanly untamable. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Because there is some really bad news here. And there's some really good news. James chapter 3 and verse 7, I'm going to again read from the NIV. James 3 and verse 7. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Now, mankind in verse 7 and human being or man in verse 8 is talking about the same group of people, just so that you're aware. The same group of people that tamed animals cannot tame the tongue. So when it says no man can tame the tongue, ladies may say, preach it, James. I understand no man can tame that tongue. That's right. But I want you to understand this includes you ladies as well. It includes you as well. When the Bible uses the term man or mankind, it's inclusive of women. Now, who said the Bible isn't inclusive? It is. It's very inclusive. So no person, maybe we could say, no person can tame the tongue. Well, that's not good news. That's not good news at all. That's the bad news part of it. Okay, so I'm a kind of a bad news first kind of guy. So if you come up to me and you say, I got good news and bad news, please tell me the bad news first. I want to get it out of the way. So James here is saying that here we are, we're living our lives, and we have a problem with our tongues. And it's a bad problem. And James has given us some examples of these bad outcomes because of our tongues. And we know that they need to be fixed. And then he says, guess what? You can't fix it. It's unfixable. You can't fix it. The tongue is disproportionately powerful. It's inherently evil, and it's humanly untamable. You can't tame it. So we have this wild body part that we can't control now. And this is a recipe for disaster in so many ways, and that is bad news. That's very bad news. Now, I wanted to give you the bad news first because I want to leave you with the good news. Here's the good news. The good news is that the tongue is divinely tameable. That's the good news. The tongue is divinely tameable. The one who made it can tame it. The one who wrote the owner's manual can fix it. Now go ahead and turn over to Exodus chapter 4. I'm going to have you hold your spot here in James. But I want to look over at Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to break into the account of Moses while he was in the desert tending sheep. And we know that this is after he had fled Egypt many years later, and he sees a burning bush on Mount Sinai. And he's so fascinated by this bush that wouldn't burn up that he goes to take a look. And when he does, he meets God in the bush for the first time. This is where he meets God. Look at Exodus chapter 4 and look at verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent." In other words, Moses says, I have a problem with my tongue. Now watch this. This is something that perhaps you've never considered before, and I think it's really encouraging. Verse 10, again. "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant." Now, you might be thinking, what does that mean? He just met God. He just met him for the first time. But Moses is saying, I had this problem before I met you, and since I met you, it hasn't changed. And we're thinking, come on, man, give it some time. I mean, give it a little bit of time. It'll change. But I want you to look at the miracles that he had just come off of in the previous 6 verses. For instance, his hand became leprous. And then what happened? It was made whole. His staff became a serpent. And then what happened? It became a staff again. Immediately. So if God wanted Moses to be a spokesman, why not fix his speech in that way? Instantly. Why not fix it that way? But nothing had changed. And so he says, I haven't been eloquent before I knew you or since I've known you. Now here's the encouraging thing. We too have a problem with our tongues before we met God and after we met God. This is a continual struggle for us that we need help with. And Moses says, but I'm slow of speech and I'm slow of tongue. And he's saying, I can't think about what I need to say, and I don't seem to say it at the right time. Maybe you've thought that before. I've felt that way at times, that you're just not sure if you said it the right way or at the right time, you don't know what to say. I think we've all felt that at some point. Now watch what the Lord says to him and how strongly he says it in verse 11. So the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord?" Here's the good news. Verse 12. "Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." So God said that he would be with our mouths and with our tongues. Now let me give you a couple verses, and I'm going to have you just write these down as a reference. We're not going to turn to all these, that you can look back and have reference of. Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 9. Jeremiah 1 verse 9. "Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth." John 14:26. John 14:26. "But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." And then Luke chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. That's Luke 12, verses 11 and 12. "And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and authorities, do not be anxious about how you shall defend yourself or what you should say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say." That is comforting. That is encouraging. God is with your mouth. God can fix the tongue. And he's the only one that can do it. And I will simply point out in Acts chapter 2, at the coming of the Holy Spirit, that God changed their tongues as a manifestation of his power and his might. You see, God is the only one that can tame the tongue. And the way for that to happen is that we need to submit ourselves to him and to get our words to agree with his words. That's the way it happens. Now, let me tell you something really important here. Satan has no power over you. Okay? Satan has no power over you. Satan cannot hurt you unless God allows it. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know it from the book of Job. That's how I know it. And also, if Satan did, you'd be dead. You'd be dead. He doesn't want you alive. And since he can't harm you, what he does is he tries to get you to turn your mouth against yourself and kill yourself. It's the same thing with the children of Israel that came out of Egypt, and we had Balaam trying to curse them. Couldn't do it. So what happened? Satan got them to curse themselves. That's what he did. He got them to curse themselves because someone else couldn't do it. So every time you speak, life and death are in the power of the tongue. And that's what his whole strategy is, to get you to speak death. That's what he's trying to do. So the tongue is humanly untamable. And here's number 4. Number 4 is this. The tongue is contrastingly productive. The tongue is contrastingly productive. Again, the adverb is the important thing here, contrastingly. Now, look back, look back at James chapter 3, and let's continue on down in verse 9. James chapter 3 and verse 9, and again I'll read from the NIV. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings, and have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Okay, now remember the adverb. I could have said the tongue's productive. It can produce life or death, but the amazing fact is that it's contrastingly productive, because it can produce good and it can produce bad. And here's what James is saying to you. You know that nature can't even do what the tongue can do. I mean, a fig tree can't bear olives, and a grapevine can't bear figs, and apples don't bear oranges, and oranges don't bear apples. That doesn't happen. You can't have bad water and good water coming out of the same spring, because it's all bad then. And here's what he's saying. He says the tongue can bless and curse because it's contrastingly productive. And with our tongues we bless God and we curse people who've been made in his likeness. See, here's what we do. We'll say, God, I bless you, or blessed be your name, or whatever it is, we're going to bless God. And then in the same sentence, we're going to say, but boy, do I hate her. She's just the biggest gossip in the church, and I told everybody that. And James says, this shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening. Now, I want to read to you this section, but I want to read it to you out of the Message Bible, because I think it's interesting how the Message Bible translates this. And sometimes it just helps make it a little bit more understandable. So I want to read this to you here. Okay, so we're going to read James chapter 3. If you want to read along in your Bible, you can, but it's not going to make a whole lot of sense, so maybe just listen. Don't be in any rush to become a teacher, my friends. Teaching is highly responsible work. Teachers are held to the strictest standards, and none of us is perfectly qualified. We get it wrong nearly every time we open our mouths. If you could find someone whose speech was perfectly true, you'd have a perfect person in perfect control of life. A bit in the mouth of a horse controls the whole horse. A small rudder on a huge ship in the hands of a skilled captain sets a course in the face of the strongest winds. A word out of your mouth may seem of no account, but it can accomplish nearly anything or destroy it. It only takes a spark, remember, to set off a forest fire. A careless or wrongly placed word out of your mouth can do that. By our speech, we can ruin the world, turn harmony to chaos, throw mud on a reputation, send the whole world up in smoke, and go up in smoke with it, smoke right from the pit of hell. This is scary. You can tame a tiger, but you can't tame the tongue. It's never been done. The tongue runs wild, a wanton killer. With our tongues, we bless God our Father, and with the same tongues, we curse the very men and women He made in His image. Curses and blessings out of the same mouth. My friends, this can't go on. A spring doesn't gush fresh water one day and brackish the next, does it? Apple trees don't bear strawberries, do they? Raspberry bushes don't bear apples, do they? You're not going to dip into a polluted mud hole and get a cup of clear, cool water, are you? Makes it pretty clear. Makes it incredibly clear. That's out of the Message version. Okay, so let me give you the good news. Because I know in this series, it's been a lot of bad news. A lot of problems, a lot of issues to deal with. But that might be the point of it, frankly, is that, it's something that we, I think, often overlook and don't think about how important our tongue is and what comes out of our mouth. But the good news is that since the tongue is contrastingly productive, in other words, it can cause a lot of damage, but it can cause a lot of blessing as well. And that is the good news, that it can be very blessing-filled for others. We have the power, brethren, of choice. We have the power of choice to bless instead of curse. Your tongue can bless your marriage. It can bless your finances. It can bless your job. It can bless your children. It can bless your adult or your parents. It can bless your family. You see, that's the way the words of God work. I think I said in another sermon, if you want to have a husband in a certain way, make him that way with your words. If you want to have a wife in a certain way, make her that way with your words. You can do that with your tongue. It can produce good fruit that you can enjoy all the days of your life. That is great news. That is good news. You see, the truth is that my parents, my grandparents, my friends, my wife, my church family, over the course of my life, have blessed me with their tongues in a way that has nurtured me, encouraged me, and watered this tree that God has planted. I think He's done the same for you. And because of that, this tree now produces good fruit that can be provided for others with words of life as well. You are all trees of life. All of you, with the good fruit that you produce from your words. You are not a product of your own. You are not a product of just what you have done. You are a product of all the years of blessing and spoken words that have been put into you. So I'd like you to just take a moment here as we close and we end this sermon and maybe ask, is there anything that God is talking to you about today? Anything that He's saying to you in this message, in this sermon, about something that you can take home? You know, sometimes we listen to sermons and we think to ourselves about problems that other people have. And we say, oh, this would be a great message for this person over here, for that person, and I'll send it to them. But we oftentimes don't sit here and think about ourselves. And maybe it is a great sermon for someone else to hear, and that doesn't stop you from sending it to them, but you have to think about, what is it for me that I can take from this message that's good? So what about you? What is there that you can take from the message today? How can you implement love and grace into the lives of others by the power that you have in your mouth? Incredible, amazing power of the tongue. It's an amazing instrument that God has given us. Life and death are in the power of the tongue.